everybody. Mike Napoleon here with SuperSpeed Golf. I'm here with a good friend of mine, Tyler Standiferd. He's a professor of biomechanics out at Utah Valley University. Tyler, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Yeah, happy to be here with you, Mike.
Yeah, it's always fun. I love getting together and talking about all this science stuff that we deal with when we're doing our Overspeed training with SuperSpeed Golf. We're going to talk about a really cool topic today that's gotten a lot of buzz especially in the last week. We had Phil Mickelson chime in on some of this on social media, and we just wanted to go through some really in-depth look at non-dominant training for the golf swing and why we use non-dominant training for everything we do here at SuperSpeed Golf. Tyler, have you had much experience working with non-dominant training or with or without our products?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. So I've been doing some research looking at some of this overspeed training now for 6-8 months, and all of the protocols I've been testing have been doing both kind of dominant and non-dominant training. So found some things I'm excited to share, and then also outside of the golf world, I've been doing quite a bit of work with our athletics department here, testing their athletes in terms of right leg, left leg asymmetries and leg dominance and force production and jumping and landing. So yeah, excited to share what I've been finding out.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I mean, obviously, when you look at other sports besides golf, non-dominant training has been a very popular thing for a long time. This is not something new or something that we claim in any way that we came up with at SuperSpeed. Mm-hmm. We're just applying some really good I would say physical training theories and things that have been proven just to make our training as efficient as possible, because we're in the trenches. Like, we're out there, we've probably got 150, 200,000 people around the world working with our SuperSpeed products, and our goal is really simple. We want to help them increase swing speed, increase performance in their golf game, and just have more fun. So that's kind of where a lot of this is coming from on the background there. Before we get into all of the different details and research that we've done, I wanted to clear up just some of the science in the background, if you will, on some of the things that we've seen out there recently, and kind of just get a better idea of exactly what we're talking about here. The first one that I want to talk about, which is something that I feel like is always misunderstood whenever we start to talk about it in the world of golf, is that concept of deceleration, or deceleration, or slowing the club down, or what does this actually mean? And I want to look at this a little bit on some of, I would say maybe a little older science, but I think still incredibly important. I think, so much of the talk that's out there now in the golf world is all about force production, reaction forces, how all of this works. And don't get me wrong, I think that's really important stuff. I know that you work with on a daily basis, but those forces, I think we were talking about something on a webinar a week or so ago, that force precedes motion. And I think that's really important, that we not only look at the forces that are happening, but what is actually happening to those resultant motions. Is that something that you look at in your lab as well?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Mike, because I think, these forces are something that can get a little confusing to our golfers that we're talking to, right? And I think when we put it into that, and we know through the laws of biomechanics, through the laws of physics, that in order to change the motion of an object, you've got to produce forces that are in that direction or opposing a direction you want to move. And so I love the idea of almost starting at the end with what's the motion goal, what are we seeing with the motion, and then almost diving back into what's going on with the force that's now causing that motion.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, for everybody out there that loves forces, we are going to talk about some of that today during this video. But what I want to start with is actually something a little different. We're going to talk about kinematics. So kinematics is really what Tyler just mentioned. This is looking at the way something moves and not really being interested or worrying about the forces that created that motion. And I think there's a lot of good information and a lot of practical stuff that we can pull from the golf swing when we look at this as well, especially when it comes to non-dominant training. So let's get a little background here. First of all, when we're measuring kinematics of the golf swing, we usually look at four main parts of our body. We're looking at how the pelvis, the thorax or trunk, the lead arm, and then the club are rotating during the golf swing, and we're measuring that rotational speed. Now, you can break the swing into more segments than that, but for general purposes, this gives us a really good idea about how that golfer is sequencing, how they're rotating. This is a graph we call the kinematic sequence. So this measures how those different segments rotate, whether they're rotating away from the target or toward the target, and a lot of different features about that. Just to give you kind of an overview of what we're looking at on this graph, this axis measures angular velocity. So this is going to be measured in degrees per second, or how fast is something rotating. Now, angular velocity is different from linear velocity or just miles per hour, because it depends on how big the radius of that circle is. Linear velocity is going to have a much different number sometimes than angular velocity. However, it's really important when we're talking about rotational biomechanics that we know what we're measuring. Now, the bottom axis here is time. So this is going to be from the start or address position of your golf swing, the top of your swing, which we define here is when the club changes direction, impact, and then through the follow through. That puts this part of that graph in the backswing. You can notice all of those lines are below zero, or they have negative angular velocity, meaning they're rotating away from the target. Then we look at this part that we like to look at a lot, which is called the downswing sequence. And that's where we're now going to be rotating back toward the target, and we're going to see relationship between how these segments move. After impact, obviously, is the follow through. Now, there's a couple really important things that we key in here on when we're looking at increasing someone's ability to create speed. One of them is something we call segmental acceleration. That's going to literally be the slope of those lines as they start to go up. We're going to see how steep that slope is. The steeper the slope, the more acceleration that player is able to create. Obviously, we find a correlation here between players that are more powerful will create higher values of segmental acceleration, usually throughout all of these different areas of the chain. The next one we look at is something we call segmental deceleration. Now, this is what we actually talk about when we talk about, whether it was what Mickelson mentioned about you can only move as fast as you can slow down. We call segmental deceleration. I also like to call it, Tyler, segmental stability or stabilization of each one of the segments. Mm-hmm. And I think a really easy way to think about this is that there's multiple different segments rotating in our body. Those different segments are connected by very complex muscle slings that allow them to rotate. So think of it this way. I never would ask a golfer to slow down your hips. I don't want you to try to slow down your hips in the golf swing. What I want you to do is produce good acceleration in the pelvis. And then I want that acceleration to be able to suddenly go the other direction when the torso fires. Because when the torso fires, if it can stabilize and fire more aggressively on top of a very stabilized pelvis, we're going to see a higher jump in rotational velocity in that segment. I've always liked to use the analogy of, it's a lot easier to shoot a cannon off the ground where it's stable on the ground than it is if you put it out on the water and it's floating in like a canoe. It's really hard to get the same amount of stability if you don't have that good base below you. So in the graph, this is what we look at. We now look at the slope of these lines as they go down. And you'll notice every one of those segments goes down a little bit after that point of acceleration. It's going to decelerate. This is what we're talking about when we talk about deceleration in the golf swing. I think it's key to understand that it's not just how can I slow the club down on the other side of impact. Impact itself does slow the club down. And honestly, by that point, all of this has already happened because we're looking at these stabilization of these segments or deceleration of the segments prior to impact, where it really matters in increasing speed up the chain. We're going to come back to this a little bit toward the end. We're going to show you some results of the studies that we've done on what super speed training and those non-dominant swings actually do to have an effect on this segmental deceleration of the golf swing. Next thing I want to look at, though, is just a broad overview here of what are our goals when we implement the training that we do with Super Speed Golf. I think the first one that's pretty obvious is we want to help players increase swing speed, but there's more to it. We come from that background of looking at swing biomechanics and looking at force and looking at all these different things that are potentially affected by the training that we are using for our players. So we also want to see that we have increases in force production. We want to see that sequencing and those rotational biomechanics improve and improve specifically in efficiency. And then we also want to do this in a way that minimizes injury risk. Because, Tyler, this is something else I think is really important. When we release a protocol or we recommend things to use our products with, we're not only talking to professional athletes that may have a fitness program in the gym and may have all kinds of recovery programs. We're also talking to amateur players who just want to get some more swing speed. This might actually be the only thing they're doing from a golf practice, a physical training standpoint. And I think that's a major point that we'll probably come back to a little bit, but it's really important another reason why we use these non-dominant swings in our training.
Yeah, such a great point, Mike. Such a great point.
So let's get into some of the reasons we put all this stuff together and why we use non-dominant training in our protocols. Some of it has to do with the keys to really what we're looking at when we're trying to train rotational power. Number one, we have to have good mobility and stability for that athlete, meaning that their body is able to go through range of motion in multiple directions in really all kinds of different areas in the golf swing. Good mobility coupled with good stability meaning the ability for those different areas to control range of motion, to stop range of motion, to absorb force. All of these different pieces are really important. We're going to show you guys a ton of really cool studies here in a second that also show this in other sports and the advantages of using non-dominant training to advance mobility, advance stability, and then also advance things like strength. It is important that a stronger player is going to have the potential to create more force, going to have the potential to hit the ball farther. So looking at how this affects strength, I think, is also an important key. I think some of the more interesting ones from my background are looking at how it affects motor control. Looking at how non-dominant training actually can have major effects on your dominant side motor control and neuromuscular control, I think is a huge piece. And I think Tyler's going to expand on this a ton here in a minute. And the last one, this is something else we saw last week, is talking about multiple and different contraction types in muscles. I think it's important to look at the fact that a muscle, even though we're trying to get force out of it in a certain type of contraction, potentially the best way to train that muscle to get the most force production out of all contractions is to train a bunch of different ways. So we'll talk about that here in a minute too. Let's look at that mobility and stability piece first. And Tyler, I wanted you to just, this is your area. This is, I'm not an academic. I am in the trenches helping people get faster. I want to toss this over to you for a second, let you talk about some of these different studies that have shown how mobility and stability works with non-dominant training in other sports.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And this is kind of, again, where my background is, right? This is what I do. My trenches are reading and reviewing research and collecting my own data. And so when I started to think about these concepts of non-dominant and dominant training, you start going into the research and realize, there's just not quite enough in golf yet. So let's go to some other rotational sports. Let's look at things like baseball, which is a great one where there's been a lot of research. And one of the first names I went to was Glenn Fleisig, who I've heard speak at many conferences, such a bright mind in biomechanics. And he talks specifically about these importance of these trunk axial rotations in baseball pitching. And he basically suggests that when you're doing these core training programs, you have to increase strength and flexibility in both directions of movement, both the right to left rotation and the left to right rotation. And this guy's been studying baseball injuries at the youth level all the way up to major leagues. Really bright guy and seeing some great things and success with limiting injuries, right? I think if we go down to these bottom two studies that we look at, I loved when, Mike, you talked about this idea of stability, mobility. This, I like to refer to it as dynamic stability, which is this idea of how do I really actively and quickly alter the directions of segments to transfer that energy up the segment. And what these groups are all saying is, hey, this occurs. It's complex in the trunk, and you've got to make sure that your trunk and pelvis is firing in all sorts of different ways, different directions. Sometimes one's doing one while the other's doing the other. That final one on the baseball one, they basically suggest we've got to reduce muscle imbalances in the trunk to maintain this core flexibility and stability and prevent injuries, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think a lot of times when we play a sport that is very one-sided like golf, I mean, we are pretty much swinging in one direction all the time, it creates a lot of imbalances in the way our muscles work. Those imbalances can actually have a negative effect on mobility. Would you agree with me?
Yeah, for sure, right? And we're not suggesting that you're not going to see some imbalances. They're going to be there in these rotational athletes. But when you start working really hard, rotating one side, you can really affect some mobility and present some complications, especially as we look at that core, the pelvis and trunk, that basic starting point of that kinematic sequence.
And, I think you can definitely see that as a good idea on, preventing injury, making sure range of motion's there. But, do you think that's also going to have a performance issue too over time?
Oh, without a doubt it will, right? Without a doubt. And that's where I think, these guys who've been doing this research in baseball, they're not just talking about injury, they're talking about performance, right? And these guys are able to increase their performance. And we have a few studies later on that even discuss this, where they're seeing that their ability to do some of these opposite side rotations actually are leading to better performance in these kind of unilateral rotational movements. So,
yeah. So let's pull back from the academic side for just a second. In your experience, because I can tell you in my experience, I've never seen it, but in your experience, have you ever seen like a high level fitness trainer, physical therapist, anyone that's physically working with an athlete, not prescribe exercises in a balanced format like this?
No, and that's such a great question, because as you start to peel back the research, or even in these just clinical settings, because I've done a lot of clinical work in my background too, you just don't see it. Like, to try and find a research study where they're only doing the dominant side rotational training, they don't exist. I think because these individuals know that it's important, especially in this core and pelvis, to really have some good strength and mobility in both sides of that direction.
Yeah, I agree. And from the golf coaching background, I always thought it was something about the golf world and the way we train golfers that was just nuts to me. It's like I looked at all these other sports and all of them are doing things, both on the dominant and non-dominant side. We started actually even having our junior players swing right-handed and left-handed up until like the ages of like 9, 10, 11 years old. And it was amazing the amount of crossover we saw and how much better these athletes were in speed, power, everything. But yeah, that was something that, when we designed these original protocols, we put this in there because we just thought it was crazy not to.
Yeah. And I think, Mike, I might add that it's almost like that's well accepted when we're training things at high force and low velocity on that force velocity curve. But now we're starting to see some things where, hey, we need to be training at lower forces and higher velocities. And it's like, for some reason, the minute you start doing this overspeed training, the thought is, let's get rid of all non-dominant training at that part of the force velocity curve. And just biomechanically, it's never made much sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's move on a little bit. I want to look at a couple more of these things on mobility stability. This is a great quote by Drew McDuffie, who many of you have probably seen online. I really like this quote. Just looking at this from, training athletes in other sports again, now we're moving, away from even baseball, but I think it's really important to look at this not only in that rehab setting, but also starting to look at it when we affect things like power. And I think, power might be even a more important place to look at some of this training, whether we're doing it with med balls or whatever, in multiple directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful.
Let's move on. And again, I think strength is a term, I think we can connect this in. It's sort of like gray area between now we're moving away from mobility, moving into that stability, and now we're moving maybe more directly into muscle strength. Let's talk a little bit about these two studies, though, because I think these are really interesting as well.
Yeah, and this is kind of like my previous point, right? You go try and find these types of studies, and when they're training, core and rotational athletes, they're always training dominant rotations and non-dominant rotations. So this is one specific to golf where they specifically did the core and the non-dominant arm. So this would be the lead arm for right-handed golfers. And then one on badminton players, which is a similar movement pattern where they're doing right to left rotations if they're right-handed with a swinging implement. And what you find is when they do these training programs, they always do dominant and non-dominant side rotational strength training. And you see wonderful results, right? You see really good results in velocity and accuracy and strength as they're training both of those sides.
Yeah, I love that you bring up badminton as well, because I actually have always, just as a kind of crazy golf science guy, I've always liked looking at kinematics of the way people smash in badminton because it's unbelievable. I mean, they're doing that full kinematic sequence like in the air,
Yep.
you know, and it's unbelievable the amount of power that goes through that motion. I
Yep.
mean, that study with the non-dominant training there was huge. I mean, they had like, what was it, a 28% gain?
Yeah, it was almost 30% gains in velocity and improvements in accuracy, which I think is what we see as well when we've been doing research with some of these overspeed trainings.
Well, again, that just leads back to efficiency. Whenever we see the kinematics of the golf swing become more efficient, that tends to see an increase in power, but it also tends to be an increase in controllable power, which I think is something I think is really important.
Yep.
You know, talking about, now let's go back to baseball a little bit. You know, one of the people that we respect very highly is Eric Cressy, you know, probably one of the top minds in training rotational athletes. For those of you who don't know, he actually runs all of the training and physical training for the Yankees. Pretty smart guy. You know, he has a lot of information out there about asymmetries, and when we have strength too much on one side, not on another, how that can cause, you know, some definite risk for injury and some other things there.
Yep.
You know, I think trying to figure this out, I mean, like, he's even recommending in some ways that you try to do more left-handed stuff if you're right-handed, even in your daily life. And then, you know, when we do more stuff in season with some of these major league players, we actually find that there's a lot of actual just the non-dominant side training, not doing both dominant and non-dominant. They're already doing dominant side activity all the time. When they're out there. They're actually doing more non-dominant training than they do non-dominant a lot of times. I think that's some pretty cool stuff from Eric Cressy.
Yeah, I love the work he's doing. So practical and just right, like you said, right there in the trenches with those rotational baseball athletes.
And I think practical is an important part here, right? Like, that's what we're about. We're trying to help people get better. You know, we're not just sitting up in our offices trying to, you know, figure out the new study and only do stuff based on, we're out there watching these players get better. And we have been for 7 years. And I mean, that's a case study in itself, in my opinion. So let's move on to another topic I think is really interesting, and that's the motor control or neuromuscular control connected with some of this work on non-dominant training.
Yeah, this is some of my favorite stuff, Mike, because I think this is such a complex question. So to simplify it to something is just, hey, what do we need to do in terms of stopping this golf club post-impact? And what are we doing training-wise? We're just really missing this big picture of this is a complex motor task that we're doing with the golf swing. And there's some unique things we can do in training that have great carryover effect that we've seen in research. And so these are 3 examples. I love these examples. One is this modified field hockey equipment where they kind of change the way that they're holding it, change some movement patterns there, and see these incredible improvements in the way they're throwing these field hockey balls and the way they're playing. My favorites, you know, were this soccer one and this long jump performance, where in soccer, they looked at these groups, and the group that trained the non-dominant leg had better improvements in skill acquisition and accuracy than the group who trained just the dominant side only. And soccer might be one of those sports.
There too, is there's, you know, something cool about that study too, Tyler, is there was actually, you know, the control group here was only training the way they always have, just on the dominant side. And on the group that had the non-dominant training in there as well did way better, right?
Yep, exactly. And that's such a great point, because, and that might be, you might look at that and say, well, soccer, they use both their right and left legs. That's kind of one of those things. And golf really doesn't do that. Well, let's enter in this long jump study where now we're talking some technique stuff for sure, without a doubt, but some real things on force production from one leg, right? They're jumping off from one leg in a long jump. And what they found is these individuals who did non-dominant side training had these carryover effects, and they were able to jump longer distances than groups who focused on their traditional training. Again, if I jump off the left leg, let's train our right leg, and we're going to get better from a motor control standpoint. Again, carryover approach, the dynamic systems theory, right?
Let's look at this. Like, golfers use both of their legs in very significant ways on the dominant side, right?
Yes.
They use every part of their body. It's just when you swing on the non-dominant side, you're using those things in a different way. And, you know, that crossover effect between learning what those patterns feel like and those feels on the non-dominant side, what we're seeing, there's big benefit to the dominant side swings. And that's just showing that in some other sports as well.
Yep.
We're not the only ones out there that have been doing this. In fact, some of the best players in the world have been doing this before we were ever even around. In fact, Dustin Johnson's been doing some of this stuff for like the last 10 years. He's been using these swings on the non-dominant side to get gains. I think Joey Deese has a good quote here too, that when we're trying to train speed in the golf swing, we're not just trying to get chaotic speed. We need controlled speed that's going to encompass a lot of these other areas. And a lot of this neuromuscular control and function that comes out of these non-dominant swings is a great way to improve that. So, just cool thing here. Here's the last one. This one, I think you're more of the expert on, but I was really intrigued about this when I started looking through this book by Cal Dietz on different types of training and training muscles and different contraction types to get increased force production. So maybe I'll let you go.
These are one of those things, Mike, where we can get lost in the weeds a little bit here, but man, Cal Dietz is doing some great work on this for a long time. And really the idea is, as we talk about muscle contractions, isometric, no change in length, concentric, kind of speeding up some movement, eccentric, slowing some things down. The thing about it is, if it's just so important to train every aspect. If that muscle group's only working concentrically in the task, no strength and conditioning coach would ever train it just concentrically. They would train it eccentrically. They would train it isometrically, because there are great benefits that come from every different contraction type. Some of the ones that Cal talks about are this idea that, the more efficiently you can engage a muscle eccentrically, the more force you can produce concentrically. And he's seen this with throwing athletes who are rotational athletes. And really almost every athlete under the sun, you see this little V, the red V in the top of his book. This is where he's talking about a steep slope of eccentric followed by concentric. And so just so important to train these muscles in every different standpoint. And I think
again, let me interrupt you for a second. I just want to bring this back. Does that mean that if I train the muscle's ability to absorb force, decelerate in one sense of the word, that means it might be able to produce more force when it goes and backs and fires the other direction? Is that
exactly, Mike? Exactly. And I think what we forget, Mike, is you have a backswing in golf. And I think we're seeing more and more that some of those faster backswings, we're seeing some more improved downswings. Now, again, you have to worry about sequencing and those things, but yes, if you can eccentrically do more with that muscle, you can get more of an energy return on it. And I think this is where, again, if we think about this force velocity curve, strength coaches use this principle all the time with these higher force or medium force, medium velocity. And it should be the same way with these lower force, high velocity training, which is the goal of overspeed training.
I agree. This is cool stuff. I think this is one that, probably requires its own webinar in itself, but for now, let's leave that. I just think it's for sure good stuff. Hey, here's a couple more of like the best players in the world, including world number one right now, John Rahm, and then that's Rory McIlroy on the other side. This looks like they're training like explosive type rotational patterns, potentially on both sides of their body. Does that seem crazy?
Yeah, right. I mean, and not when you think about the research that we just looked at, right? This is what we would expect to see these elite athletes doing, right?
I think it's neat here. They're even measuring force output, on both sides here in that John Rahm video. So yeah, again, this is not stuff that is crazy. Like, this is not stuff that people aren't doing. These are the actual types of training that the best players in the world are doing regularly. We're just making it easy for them to get it into their program by having non-dominant training in our SuperSpeed training protocols.
Yeah, such a good point, Mike, because most of our users, and we have those elite level users that love the product, but what about those recreational golfers that don't have time to get in the gym that you mentioned? We got to introduce some of this stuff to them. And in these protocols is a great, easy way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it might be the only fitness program some players have. And I'm not trying to say that this is the only program they should have. I think it's more efficient. We've set our products up in a good, better, best kind of scenario, right? On the good side, if you just pull this out of the box, it's all you're doing, and you follow the videos, you're going to get good results. And we know you're going to get those good results. You're going to get them safely, and it's going to be a lot of fun. Better would be you probably have a supporting physical program that just kind of dots the I's and crosses the T's and make sure that everything's working as efficiently as it can. Think you're going to get better results, and best incorporate that in with your golf program as well. So it's right there in with your mechanical coaching pieces, and everything's working in harmony.
Yep.
What I want to do now is actually talk about some findings that you've found in your studies that you've done with our SuperSpeed products. So this is going to be kind of fun. There's some from our studies that we've done internally as well, over the years. I wanted to share some too, but this is your study first, right?
Yeah. So this is a study I did in my lab here at Utah Valley University, where I was able to take some athletes through this 6-week level 1 protocol. And I wanted to really peel under the hood and say, what's happening? We know swing speeds are increasing. We've known that for 6-7 years as you followed SuperSpeed. But why? What's happening in terms of this force? And just a few key highlights of this, right? First is increases in vertical force on the lead leg during the downswing. So they're getting more vertical force to that lead leg at about 16%. And again, these are golfers who didn't change anything outside of what they were doing. You just give them the box. This is the good scenario that you just talked about, Mike. This is all these guys were doing. So again, more force going to that lead leg, which we know is related to swing speeds. A lot of groups have done some things with that. I like this one at the top of the swing. They're actually almost loading into the trail side better. So that we saw 20% more force on the trail side at the top of their swing, more in line in what we'd see with elite level golfers.
I'm curious, Tyler,
yeah.
Is like 16% increase in peak vertical force, is that a lot?
I mean, if I gave this to one of my strength and conditioning coaches that I'm working with here at Utah Valley University, 6 weeks, 16%, their minds would be blown. I mean, these guys every person would be trying to do the protocol that led to this 16%.
I mean, I can tell you what happens to us is every time we give that kind of data to one of these coaches, whatever sport they coach, they want products for that sport. So, I mean, that's what our experience has been. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a big change, right?
Yeah, these are big numbers. And this was stuff that I didn't know what I was going to find. I thought I'm going to see some increases in swing speeds, but some of these force measurements were just honestly mind-blowing is a good way to think about it. But it's occurring, right? I'm measuring forces at 1,000 frames per second. I'm using my advanced motion capture systems. This isn't me fiddling around. This is high-level research equipment, and I'm finding these numbers, right? The third one was the one that I thought was really neat, which is this something in biomechanics we look at a lot is this: how much force can you apply and how long can you apply it for? And this directly relates to how we can transfer some of these momentums. And so in a simple way, what we found is from that top of the swing to kind of club vertical, club parallel, where we really want to be starting to generate really high velocities, we saw a 40% increase in the impulse during that time. They're getting more force forward. They're slowing down the swing a little bit at that start so that they can really explode through the ball. That was one that I deal with impulse a lot. I deal with it with a lot of the athletes. And so to see it in this golf example was wonderful.
Remember, force precedes motion, right?
Exactly.
So like if these forces are increasing, that's improving, the, I guess, efficiency of the kinematics that we looked at earlier, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's where we lead to, you say sequencing, this fourth one, right? We really want these forces to be peaking at the right time. We want the correct sequencing. And what we found is that we actually got a 15% decrease in terms of some of these time components, right? Meaning what we're really doing is we're getting it moving faster through that impact zone, right? Which is wonderful. And then you can see, what do we see? Well, 5% increase in the driver velocity, 7 ball speed, 7 carry distance. Again, 6 weeks of only SuperSpeed using both dominant and non-dominant training.
And I think it's interesting that 5% that's consistent with the same number we've seen for 7 years from our initial studies to having thousands of data points. It all seems to ride right around that 5% number for some reason. Cool stuff. Here's just a graph of what you were talking about there in this study of looking at the difference in that lead leg vertical force.
Yeah, and this is just really quickly on this, right? This was one golfer, blue post, red pre, and they got a huge jump in how much force they're producing. So the y-axis is percentage of body weight. But the other thing that happened too is, when does that force occur? Because if you transfer force to that lead leg too late, it's kind of just a waste of energy. And so this is a cool one where elite level ball strikers, these are PGA Tour players, they suggest that they peak at about 83% of their downswing. Well, what did this golfer do? They went from it peaking right around impact to peaking at 83% of the downswing. So their sequencing is improving with some of these drills that they would do in this level 1 protocol.
Yeah, that's cool. So let's go back to these kinematics graphs for a second and look at one of the things that we found in some of our internal SuperSpeed studies. We see big increases in those peak velocities. So how fast each one of these segments is able to rotate. In fact, it's about 18% in the pelvis, 16% in the torso, 8% in the lead arm, and the club's up 6% in rotational velocity. That's, data we've been saying for a long time. We've had this from a study a few years ago. But those are big numbers too. Again, we're seeing these increases in force. Force precedes motion. Yep. And then this is really looking at the motion and what that effect it's having on the motion.
Yep.
Here's a newer one that I think is really interesting. And this is, remember that non-dominant training is so important on working on the stability elements of these different segments. So now we're going to look at how much increase we have in the ability of those segments to stabilize. We can call this whatever factor you want. Basically, we're measuring this in degrees per second, right? We're measuring the slope of this line as it's going down. We see in the pelvis that deceleration factor is up 18% after our training in 6 weeks. In the torso, it's 14%. And in the arm, it's about 11% on average. Some pretty cool stuff, but that's just kind of showing exactly some of the effects of what's going on during this training.
Yep.
Now, I think this was kind of fun, Tyler. Tyler called me this morning and just basically said, look, I feel so strongly about how important this non-dominant training is and how crazy it would be to not do this when we're doing this overspeed training. I'm going to pull somebody into my lab today, this morning, at random, and look exactly what's gonna happen. And so can you tell us a little bit about how this happened and what happened this morning?
Yeah, that's such a great point, Mike, right? After looking at this all weekend long and seeing things going on, I thought, again, I'm just confident in this. So I grabbed a golfer. He's been playing for a couple of years. He's an athletic guy, one of my college students. And I said, hey, come in. I didn't tell him anything. I gave him a good warm up to get the blood pumping. He rode a bike a little bit, hit some 8-irons, hit some drivers, kind of ramped some things up. Because I wanted to do this the right way, Mike, right? I want to do it the right way. So he gets good and warmed. And then I say, okay, let's blast drivers, 3 drivers as fast as you can. And then I'm going to take you through the level 1 protocol, the warm up and the protocol. But what I did this time is I said, you know what, instead of doing dominant and non-dominant, or just dominant, I said, let's just do non-dominant. Let's have him swing left-handed. So I took him through the protocol. He's only making left-handed swings. About halfway through the protocol, he actually stops and asks me, Tyler, am I going to do right-handed swings with these? And I said, oh, no, not today. We're just going to do these left-handed swings. So he went through the whole protocol, put him back on it, measured him on my TrackMan, on my force plates. What did I see? Well, I saw a 12% increase in that lead leg vertical force, right? Similar to what we saw with our study when we did dominant and non-dominant. What was great about this, Mike, is it's when it occurred. He was going from peaking at like club parallel after impact to peaking at club vertical before impact.
So wait a second. Let me just, again, I don't want to interrupt, but he didn't make any dominant side swings after his warm up, right? He warmed up, hit some shots, and then you just had him swing on the non-dominant side the entire time, right?
That's it. He did not. Yeah. Again, he was just as confused as you were when he did this, Mike, because he's thinking, surely I should be making some right-handed swings if we're going to measure right-handed swings. And again, the sequencing, the kinetic sequencing improved, right? It was mind-blowing to me that we saw those things, but also not when you start to think about the importance of the deceleration and the dynamic stability of this core, right? So 12% increases in that force. And again, the peaking from after impact to about 80% of the downswing, which is our elite level players.
Let's also mention that his swing speed went up 6.5%, even though he didn't even do speed training on his dominant side in this particular session.
All he did was non-dominant.
And his carry distance went up 7%.
Yep. I mean, when I showed him one of his swings on there, it popped up like a 115 swing speed, and he almost fell over when he saw it. One of his carries was 275, total of 310, and the guy just, again, you can imagine just how pumped he was about it, and shocked that left-handed swings led to that kind of result.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, these are things that I've seen in the trenches for years and years and years. Non-dominant training has so many positive effects, just from balancing out the body, muscle activation, and then also getting into that point of reducing some of that one side only stress that we do in the golf swing. So, you know, that was really our goal at SuperSpeed in introducing these into our protocols. And I mean, we're tried and true believers that this is really good stuff for athletes of all levels to be doing, but especially for these amateur players out there that are just trying to get a little bit better and increase some speed.
Yep. Yeah. Such a great point to think about those individuals that aren't getting any other training outside of this overspeed training, and just how essential and important it is. It's not that you can't gain speed with dominant only training, but you can do so much more and create such a more long-term, healthy, stable swing, stable base when doing those non-dominant swings. Yeah,
I agree. I'm not opposed. I think we could probably get some speed gains out of just doing dominant training. I just don't know why you would ever want to do it, because you can get so many additional gains and do it more safely. And I don't know. I mean, that's kind of what we're about here at SuperSpeed, and adding in these non-dominant swings is definitely something we're keeping. Tyler, thanks so much for sharing all of your knowledge and information today. I hope everybody enjoyed this. You know, from all of us here at SuperSpeed, you know, get out there and get into some training, and make sure you include those non-dominant swings in it.